The number 12 hit me before the devices did. 12. That's how many accounts, spread across 7 civilizations, describe instruments that gathered something from the sky and turned it into usable power. Not fire, not falling water, something else. Something that left behind residue in the stonework that modern metallurgists have still not satisfactorily explained. The researchers who found them didn't make headlines. Their papers disappeared into institutional archives. And the objects themselves, well, that's the part that keeps me up at night. They went somewhere, or someone made sure they stopped existing. I want to be clear before we go any further. I am not standing here telling you I have proof of an ancient civilization that harnessed stellar energy and was systematically erased. What I'm telling you is that I spent 7 months trying to disprove what I found. Couldn't. And once you start looking at the pattern, the real pattern, it becomes very difficult to look away. I found the first thread while researching something else entirely. It was a footnote in a 1953 translation of the Sumerian Nippur Astronomical Compendium, a document housed at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology, catalogued as CBS 11901. The footnote referenced a series of copper alloy instruments described in the text as girnan, a phrase that most translators render as sublime fire vessels. But the scholar whose footnote I was reading, a Dr. Walther Hinz, noted something unusual. The vessels were described as receiving their energy inasame from the heavens, but specifically during the transit of particular star clusters, not the sun, not the moon, stars, specific named stars. He flagged the anomaly. Then his career moved elsewhere. The footnote was never followed up. I went looking for CBS 11901 myself. The document exists. It sits in a catalog. When I asked to access the relevant section, I was told the relevant tablets had been removed for conservation assessment in 2007. No return date was given. Let me be fair to the official narrative here. The official story goes like this. Ancient civilizations were sophisticated within the limits of their technology. They built monuments, developed calendars, traded across vast distances, and left behind remarkable art and writing. Their cosmologies were rich and poetic. When they described objects that drew power from celestial sources, scholars understand these as religious or mythological metaphors, the language of ritual, not engineering. The girnan vessels, if they were instruments at all, were almost certainly ceremonial. Astronomically timed rituals were common. Temple objects were often described in language that attributed divine or cosmic function to what were essentially symbolic tools. This is the consensus, and I want to honor it, because it's not wrong. It's just incomplete. Let's start with the numbers. The accounts I've been able to document, 12 separate instances, 7 civilizations, spanning approximately 2,400 years, share 4 specific structural features that are almost impossible to explain through parallel mythological development alone. First, the devices are always described as absorbing energy during astronomical events, not generating it from earthly fuel. Second, they are always described in pairs or multiples, never as single instruments. Third, they always involve a material component described in terms that suggest a metallic lattice or grid structure. And fourth, and this is the feature that stopped me cold, they are always described as being destroyed or hidden not by invaders, not by accident, but by the civilization's own priestly or administrative class. That last point is not subtle. That's the pattern. The second account comes from the Egyptian Edfu building texts, a series of inscriptions at the Temple of Edfu in Upper Egypt. The texts, which Egyptologists date to the Ptolemaic period but which are believed to record far older source material, describe a series of instruments used in the pre-dynastic Zep Tepi, the first time, that collected what the texts call BJA endpoint, the iron of the sky. The phrase is typically translated as meteoritic iron, and that's reasonable. Meteoritic iron was sacred in ancient Egypt. The blades of Tutankhamun's dagger were made from it. But the Edfu building texts describe these instruments not as blades or weapons, but as receptacles. Hollow containers with internal structure. They were used, according to the text, at specific moments when certain star groups were in precise alignment. And they were, according to the text, deliberately drowned in the sacred lake when the first time ended. Drowned, deliberately, by the priests. Speaking of deliberate concealment, there's a related anomaly in the pre-Columbian record that deserves attention. In 1969, a team from the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of American Ethnology was cataloging the contents of a storage facility attached to a site in coastal Peru, a site now identified as part of the Paracas Cultural Complex. Among the objects recorded in their field notes, reference series 74 PRN, was a description of 12 copper-inlaid stone discs arranged in a specific geometric pattern in a sealed subchamber. The field notes describe internal channels in the stone, channels too fine to have been made with the tools the Paracas are believed to have possessed. The lead archaeologist on the project noted in her personal correspondence that I found through a Freedom of Information request to the Smithsonian Archives, that the channels were arranged as if to collect and concentrate something radiating from above. The official publication of the site's findings, issued in 1974, does not mention the discs. The subchamber is described only as a ritual storage space. The discs themselves are listed as transferred to institutional collection. No catalog number was ever assigned. That's not a filing error. That's a decision. Which brings me to the third account, and perhaps the most technically specific. In 1904, a German engineer named Karl Schappler was granted access to a series of clay tablets held by the Ottoman Imperial Museum in Constantinople. The tablets, of uncertain provenance but consistent with late Akkadian period cuneiform, described a series of instruments Schappler later called Lichtempfänger light receivers. He was not a mystic. He was an engineer. And what caught his attention was the technical specificity of the descriptions. The tablets described a lattice-like internal structure, a specific orientation requirement relative to the celestial pole, and a process by which the instruments produced what the text called physical heat, not spiritual warmth, not symbolic fire, but a measurable thermal effect. Schappler spent 3 years attempting to replicate what the tablets described using contemporary materials. His workshop notes, held by the Austrian National Archives in Vienna under reference collection E/Tech/1907-12, describe several partial successes. Then his funding was withdrawn. His notes were confiscated for a period of 2 years during the First World War. When they were returned, his workshop had burned in an incident classified as accidental. Maybe that's what it was. But the timing is almost theatrical. Let's go further. The timeline isn't subtle. In 1932, a researcher named Lily Kalisko published findings in the Biodynamic Farming Journal suggesting that metallic salts crystallize differently during astronomical transits, specifically during the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter. Her methodology was dismissed as uncontrolled. But in 2005, a team at the University of Graz conducted a controlled replication of Kalisko's core experiment and published findings in Crystal Research and Technology confirming that silver nitrate crystallization showed measurable, reproducible variation correlated with lunar position. The mechanism remains unexplained. That doesn't prove ancient star-powered devices. But it suggests that the physical relationship between stellar events and material properties is not as settled as we tend to assume. Speaking of unsettled assumptions, there's something buried in the work of Egyptologist Schwaller de Lubicz that most accounts gloss over. In his 1957 work, The Temple of Man, a study of the Temple of Luxor that remains one of the most detailed architectural analyses ever conducted on an ancient Egyptian site, de Lubicz documented a series of chambers whose orientations do not align with any solar or lunar event. They align, he argued, with specific stars at specific moments in the astronomical cycle. Not the famous Orion's belt alignment. Different stars. And embedded in the walls of those chambers, de Lubicz recorded the presence of thin copper deposits arranged in geometric patterns that, he noted, were structurally similar to what we would now recognize as antenna arrays. He did not make that comparison explicitly. He lacked the vocabulary. But the geometry is there in the plates. The part that matters, those copper deposits were removed from 3 of the 4 chambers during a restoration project in the 1960s. The Egyptian Antiquities Organization, which supervised the project, has no record of where the material was deposited. We're now looking at a pattern across 5 civilizations, 9 centuries of documented accounts, and at least 4 separate instances of archival suppression or material disappearance. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. But the recurrence of specific features, the lattice structure, the stellar timing, the institutional destruction, that's not a coincidence. That's a fingerprint. Let me add the Indus Valley. Among the objects excavated at Mohenjo-Daro during the 1926-31 expedition led by John Marshall and Ernest Mackay, objects catalogued in Marshall's own publication, Mohenjo-Daro and the Indus Civilization, Volume 2, there are 15 bronze objects of unclear function. They are shaped like shallow bowls with internal ribbing. Marshall described them as ritual vessels of unknown purpose. What he does not describe in the publication but does note in his private field journals held at the British Library, India Office Records, reference MSS Ur F215, is that the internal ribbing was arranged in a logarithmic spiral pattern. A logarithmic spiral. In bronze. In 2500 BCE. In objects the size of a dinner plate. The logarithmic spiral does not appear naturally in metalworking without deliberate mathematical intent. It is the same pattern found in the antenna arrays of certain modern electromagnetic receivers. Marshall noted the unusual internal structure and said no more. The objects were distributed between the British Museum and the Archaeological Museum in Karachi. The Karachi collection was partially destroyed during flooding in 1973. The British Museum objects, when I contacted them, were described as in storage, not currently accessible for viewing. There's a document I want you to hold in your mind, not because it proves anything, because of what it implies. In March of 1947, just months before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the establishment of the CIA, the United States Army's Foreign Technology Division released an internal report, declassified in 2001, available at the National Archives, reference RG 319, Box 741, examining several captured German research programs relating to what the report calls non-conventional energy reception. The report summarizes 6 research programs from the 1930s and early 1940s. 5 of them were based, the report states explicitly, on pre-war translations of ancient texts. The report recommends that the relevant text translations be consolidated under restricted access. That is a direct quote from the document. Consolidated. Under restricted access. What texts? Which translations? The report doesn't say. The accompanying appendices are still classified. Maybe the ancient texts in question were irrelevant. Maybe the consolidation was purely administrative. Maybe the German research was pseudoscience that the Army correctly dismissed after a summary review. All of that is possible. But here's what matters. The apparatus for suppressing information about this research existed. It was used. And the texts that prompted the research in the first place have never been publicly identified. Now let's talk about what remains. The Antikythera mechanism, discovered in 1901 and dated to approximately 87 BCE, demonstrates that ancient engineers were capable of mechanical precision so advanced that its equivalent didn't reappear in the archaeological record for 1400 years. That's not a metaphor or a theory. That's the consensus position of modern historians of science. The Antikythera device was a working astronomical computer built from bronze gears. It exists. It works. Predicted eclipses. If that level of engineering sophistication was possible, and if the 12 accounts I've documented describe instruments that responded physically to stellar events, instruments whose material properties we are now only beginning to understand, then the question isn't whether such devices were theoretically possible. The question is why the record is so fragmented. And the answer, again and again, isn't ignorance. It's removal. The Baghdad battery, a clay jar with copper cylinder and iron rod dated to 250 BCE, discovered near Kujut Rabu in 1936, held at the National Museum of Iraq, produces approximately 1.5 volts of current when filled with an acidic solution. The official explanation is that it was a storage vessel for sacred scrolls. That explanation was published in 1940. In 1940, proving that an ancient culture possessed even proto-electrical technology would have redrawn the entire history of science. The scroll storage explanation was convenient. I don't have answers, only patterns. The pattern is this. 12 specific accounts, from Sumer to Egypt to the Indus Valley to coastal Peru, describe devices with similar structural features. A metallic lattice, a stellar orientation, a thermal or energetic output, and a deliberate institutional suppression at the end of each civilization's primary period. The research that has come closest to replicating what these texts describe has consistently been interrupted, by funding withdrawal, by archival restriction, by material disappearance, by fire. The modern institutions holding the relevant objects have, in case after case, placed them in inaccessible storage. Maybe every one of those events has an innocent explanation. Funding dries up. Archives reorganize. Objects corrode and require conservation. Museums have storage crises. Maybe. But the copper deposits from Luxor went somewhere. The Paracas discs went somewhere. The German research translations went somewhere. The appendices of RG 319, Box 741 still haven't come out. There was a woman named Anna Bolfan. She was a Yugoslav archaeologist who, between 1967 and 1972, excavated a series of Bronze Age sites in what is now Slovenia. Her field notes describe 3 bronze instruments, internally ribbed, oriented in a specific astronomical alignment, and found in a context suggesting deliberate burial rather than abandonment. She submitted a paper to the Journal of Archaeological Science in 1974. The paper was not published. She resubmitted it in 1976 and 1979. She retired in 1981. The field notes are held at the Slovenian Museum of Natural History in Ljubljana. Reference series AB/1967-72. I have read them. The instruments she described match. They match the Mohenjo-Daro vessels. They match the Sumerian accounts. They match the copper deposits from Luxor, the lattice structure, the stellar orientation, the thermal anomaly she measured in the soil directly above the burial context. 3 instruments. Slovenia, 1500 BCE, deliberately buried, by someone who knew or at least suspected what they were. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The archive still exists. The field notes are still there in Ljubljana, in a green cardboard folder on a shelf in a room that the public can access by appointment. Anna Bolfan's instruments were removed from the excavation site in 1972. They were accessioned to the museum collection. Their current location in the collection is listed as under review. They have been under review for 53 years. I don't know what these devices were. I don't know whether they worked the way the texts suggest. I don't know whether the suppression I've documented was coordinated or coincidental, deliberate or bureaucratic. What I know is that 12 accounts from 7 civilizations describe something real enough to be worth destroying. And what I know is that the destruction, the archival restriction, the inaccessible storage, the unfollowed footnotes is still happening. The last thing Anna Bolfan wrote in her field notes before the excavation closed reads, in translation, "The instruments wanted to face the sky. Even buried, they faced the sky." I don't know what that means, but I can't stop thinking about it.